The woods behind the old Merrin property were never quiet. Even on windless nights, something moved between the trees, something slow, deliberate, and familiar, like footsteps echoing a memory no one wanted to remember. Locals said the forest kept its own heartbeat, and that if you stayed long enough, you could hear it pulse beneath the soil, steady as a warning. But no one stayed. Not after what the Merrins were accused of. Not after Elias disappeared. For decades, the Merrin family had been nothing more than a whispered legend, a name spoken in lowered voices by people who swore they saw twin shadows gliding through the tree line at dusk. The stories were always the same: every son born into the family married his twin, bound to a tradition older than the house itself. No one asked why. No one dared. Because the ones who did were said to vanish, and the forest had a way of swallowing their screams before anyone else could hear them. But legends have a way of resurfacing, especially the ones built on fear. And when a storm tore through the region one autumn night, uprooting half the forest and exposing a cabin long hidden by thick, unnatural growth, the truth the Merrins fought to bury finally clawed its way back into the world. Dust-covered furniture, broken lanterns, and dark stains marked the floorboards. But the journal on the table, untouched by time, as if it had been waiting, held the darkest secret of all. It belonged to Elias Merrin, the only son who refused to marry his twin. The only son who survived. And as the trembling hands that opened the journal discovered, the story inside was not one of rebellion, but of warning. A warning written for anyone who dared step into the woods where two souls once became one, and where one chose to break the bond. The forest had been waiting ever since. The discovery of the abandoned Merrin cabin began on a late October afternoon, when the woods were at their quietest and the cold had started to seep into the ground, carrying with it the sharp scent of decay and something older, something that felt as if it had been waiting beneath the fallen leaves. The storm that had ripped through the region the previous night had toppled several ancient trees, creating a path where there had never been one before, and it was this accidental doorway into the deeper forest that led the search party to something no one knew still existed. At first, they noticed nothing more than a faint outline between the trees, half hidden by moss and tangled branches, but as they pushed through the undergrowth, the structure revealed itself inch by inch, like a secret emerging from the shadows after a lifetime of silence. It didn't look abandoned so much as concealed, as if someone or something had purposefully buried it under decades of wild growth to ensure it would never be found. The cabin's wood was darkened almost black, the boards warped from age but still unnervingly sturdy, preserved in a way that didn't make sense for something exposed to the elements for so long. The windows were covered from the inside with tattered curtains, yet none showed signs of weather damage. Even the door, though hanging crookedly from one hinge, appeared untouched by rot. The air around it was unnaturally still, dense with the scent of damp earth and the faint metallic trace of old secrets. What struck them most was the feeling, an inexplicable pressure, like the forest itself was watching, waiting to see who would dare open the door. When they stepped inside, dust swirled through the air, but the interior seemed frozen in time, as if the people who had once lived there had simply stood up and walked away mid-movement. A cracked plate remained on the table, a lantern still sat beside it, and a child's wooden toy lay exactly where it must have been dropped decades earlier. There were no cobwebs, no animal nests, nothing to explain why nature had not claimed the place. On the far wall, the faint outline of symbols carved into the wood caught their attention, patterns that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if marking the space for a purpose long forgotten. And then, on a small table near the corner, resting beneath a thin layer of dust yet oddly preserved, was a leather-bound journal with a single name inscribed inside the cover in faded ink: Elias Merrin. The moment they touched it, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, and the woods outside fell into a silence so absolute it felt alive, as if the very trees were listening to the secret that had finally been uncovered. The hidden journal belonging to Elias Merrin revealed itself like a voice rising from the dead, each page worn but intact, its ink faded just enough to suggest age without losing clarity. The book felt strangely warm in the hands of those who opened it, as though it had been waiting, preserving itself with a determination that defied time. The first few pages were filled with ordinary entries, recounting small tasks, the weather, and quiet observations about life in the Merrin household. But even these mundane lines carried an undertone of unease, as if Elias had already sensed the dark weight of the tradition he and his sister were expected to embrace. It was the subsequent entries, however, that shifted the atmosphere of the cabin from eerie to suffocating, as the handwriting grew more frantic and the thoughts more fragmented. Elias wrote in short, clipped sentences, often crossing out his own words, sometimes writing over them again as if terrified that someone else might read the truth he had barely dared to think. The recurring phrases were what unsettled the searchers most: the bond of two, the night of choosing, and a soul must not be left unpaired. These lines appeared again and again, sometimes written in the margins, sometimes repeated on the same page as though Elias could not escape their meaning. He spoke of lessons taught since childhood, whispered in the dark by elders who told him he was one half of a single spirit, destined to reunite with his twin sister Lyra through a ritual that none of the children were allowed to witness until the moment arrived. Elias' voice on the page shifted from reluctant acceptance to growing dread as he began to understand that the tradition was not symbolic but literal, enforced not by belief but by fear of something lurking beyond the family's grasp. In one entry, he described waking to the sound of chanting in the woods, rhythmic and low, echoing through the trees as if the forest itself was answering back. He wrote about Lyra gripping his hand so tightly her nails drew blood, whispering that she didn't want the binding ceremony, that something in the woods followed her whenever she was alone. Elias' words became more frantic when he wrote about seeing figures moving between the trees, tall shapes that didn't belong to any member of the family, watching the cabin from just beyond the reach of lantern light. The more he wrote, the more it became clear he feared not only the ritual but the thing the ritual was meant to prevent. On the final pages, Elias pleaded with anyone who might find the journal to never trust the Merrin blood, insisting that the truth was not in the ritual itself but in what waited in the woods if the ritual was broken. Local whispers about the Merrin family had been drifting through the nearby towns for generations, half-remembered stories passed among elders who spoke in low voices, careful never to be overheard by the children. These whispers always circled around the matter of their twins, because unlike ordinary families where the birth of twins brought celebration, the arrival of twins in the Merrin bloodline was treated with a fearful reverence that outsiders never fully understood. People claimed the Merrin twins were different, marked by something ancient, born under strange circumstances, with midwives reporting that the air inside the birthing room felt heavy and unnaturally cold, as if a presence lingered just out of sight. Most families rejoiced at the sound of two newborn cries, but the Merrin elders responded with a solemn silence, as though they were welcoming not children but responsibilities handed down by something older than their name. Each set of twins seemed to vanish from public view as soon as they could walk, allowed outside only under the watch of watchful adults and never without one twin clutching the hand of the other. Rumors grew when people noticed that disappearances in the region almost always coincided with the periods after a Merrin twin pair reached adulthood. A hunter would go missing in the woods, or a traveler passing through would never be seen again, and the locals claimed it was no coincidence. They said the Merrins knew something lived deep within the forest, something that awoke whenever a twin resisted the path laid out for them. The stories varied, but the chilling part was how similar the details remained across decades. Some spoke of hearing two voices humming at night, intertwining like a chant carried through the trees. Others swore that they saw two identical figures walking along the tree line, their steps synchronized, their pale faces turned toward anyone who dared to watch. These sightings always happened at dusk, when the woods glowed with that faint, dying light that blurred shadows into shapes and made it impossible to tell what was human and what was not. Most disturbing of all were the whispers about the forest rituals. The Merrin elders would lead their twins into the woods on certain nights when the moon was high and full and no one returned until dawn. The villagers claimed they heard laughter from the trees, but the sound felt wrong, stretched too thin, too harmonious, as if two throats were sharing one breath. When the pairs returned, they walked more closely than before, staring at anyone who approached with an expression that felt too unified, too knowing. And whenever someone tried to ask what happened during those nights, the Merrin twins would smile in a way that made even the bravest men turn away, muttering that some truths should remain buried where the forest can keep them. The strange symbols carved into the trees around the Merrin property were first noticed by hikers long before anyone connected them to the family's dark history. At a glance, the carvings looked like random marks made by someone passing through, but the longer one looked, the more deliberate they appeared, arranged with a precision that suggested purpose rather than vandalism. Each symbol was carved deep into the bark, too deep for ordinary tools, the grooves smooth as if shaped by something far sharper than a blade. The trees bearing these marks were spaced at unnervingly consistent intervals, forming a circular boundary around the land, as though creating a perimeter. What was most unsettling, however, was the way the symbols seemed to shift in appearance depending on the time of day. In bright daylight, they resembled simple geometric shapes, triangles, spirals, intersecting lines. But at dusk, when the fading light stretched shadows across the forest floor, the markings seemed to change, contorting subtly until they resembled something closer to eyes, or faces, or warnings etched by hands no one ever saw. Locals claimed these carvings had existed longer than the Merrin cabin itself, though no one could agree on who had made them. Some insisted the Merrin ancestors carved them generations ago to keep something out, while others believed they were meant to keep something in. Hunters who wandered too close to the marked trees sometimes reported a strange sensation, a pressure at the back of the neck as if they were being watched, and animals avoided the perimeter entirely, growing restless whenever they approached the markings. Even the birds refused to nest in trees bearing the symbols, leaving the area eerily silent except for the soft rustling of leaves that always seemed to move against the wind. As people began mapping the symbol-bearing trees, a pattern emerged. The boundary outlined a path leading deeper into the woods, a path that only became visible at dusk when the glow of the setting sun hit the carvings at just the right angle. The path seemed to pulse faintly with light, a natural trick of the forest that shouldn't have been possible, yet it happened consistently enough to unsettle anyone who witnessed it. The more one followed the symbols, the stronger the sense of being guided or warned became, as though the forest itself was pointing toward something hidden deeper within its shadows. Those who followed the trail far enough claimed they heard faint whispers, not loud enough to decipher but too human to ignore, echoing between the trees in rhythmic patterns that matched the carvings. And every single person who walked that path reported the same feeling: the symbols weren't created to scare wanderers away. They were created to protect them from whatever waited beyond the final marked tree. The disturbing family portrait from 1894 became one of the most unsettling artifacts connected to the Merrin legacy, a single image capable of stirring a sense of dread even before anyone understood its significance. It was found in a warped wooden chest beneath the cabin's floorboards, wrapped in brittle cloth as if someone had tried to hide it from both time and memory. When the cloth was peeled away, the photograph revealed 7 sets of twins arranged in 3 stiff rows, each pair standing shoulder to shoulder with a closeness that felt unnatural, their expressions blank, their bodies rigid as though they had been posed not for a portrait but for documentation. The more one stared, the more the eyes of the twins seemed to reflect something hollow, something instructed rather than natural, as if the children had been told not just to stand still but to behave as if they were one being instead of two. Every twin pair, except one, held hands tightly, so tightly that in some cases their fingers appeared almost fused in the dim light captured by the old camera. The exception was Elias Merrin and his sister Lyra. Unlike the other pairs, they stood with a noticeable distance between them, their hands by their sides, their eyes not fixed on the camera but on something or someone, positioned just outside the frame. Lyra's posture was tense, her shoulders drawn slightly upward, while Elias appeared caught mid-breath, as though he had just been whispered something unsettling. Their separation was small yet glaring, a quiet rebellion that contrasted sharply with the rigid unity of the other twins. Observers often noted that Elias and Lyra looked afraid, but not of the photographer. Their fear seemed directed toward the rest of the children, whose expressions carried a strange, uniform calmness that bordered on eerie serenity. Another unsettling detail of the portrait was the backdrop. Though the picture was supposedly taken inside the Merrin house, faint tree-like shapes were visible behind the subjects, almost too defined to be shadows yet far too uneven to be wallpaper. The longer one looked, the more those shapes resembled the forest surrounding the property, as if the woods had somehow intruded into the room or the children had been positioned in front of a place where the interior and the wild began to blend. Some even claimed the shadows in the background formed pairs of elongated silhouettes mirroring the twins, aligning just slightly off, like echoes out of step. Historians later noted that the date of the portrait coincided with what Merrin records referred to as a choosing year, a time marked by unusual rituals and unexplained losses in the family. And while the other twins in the photograph aged into adulthood with the same blank unity captured in the picture, Elias and Lyra were the only ones whose fates diverged, their distance in the portrait foreshadowing the rebellion and the horror that would eventually tear the Merrin tradition apart. The idea that the Merrin twins were one soul split in two was not merely a poetic superstition whispered by elders, it was the foundation upon which their entire upbringing was built. From the moment the twins could understand language, they were taught that their existence depended on the presence of the other, that life without their counterpart would leave them incomplete, vulnerable, and exposed to forces lurking just beyond the visible world. This belief was woven into every aspect of their childhood. They were never allowed to sleep in separate rooms, never permitted to learn separately, and never trusted to wander the property unless they held hands with their twin. To outsiders, it might have seemed like an extreme form of closeness, but among the Merrins, it was presented as necessity, an unbreakable rule enforced with a gravity that left no room for doubt or interpretation. The elders explained this doctrine through stories they told in hushed voices near the hearth, tales of long-ago ancestors who defied the bond and suffered consequences too terrible to describe fully. These stories always ended the same way, with the reminder that the forest was listening, waiting for any sign of division between the twins. The children grew up internalizing the sense that something outside their family, something ancient and hungry, could sense even the smallest distance between them. Over time, this belief blurred the line between fear and devotion, making the twins cling to one another not out of affection but out of a deep, instinctive terror of what separation might bring. When the children reached adolescence, the lessons became harsher, stripped of the comforting metaphors used in their early years. Elders began preparing them for the binding ceremony, telling them it was not a marriage in the way outsiders understood, but a restoration of the divided soul into a single, stronger force capable of keeping the forest's presence at bay. They were told that without this ritual, their souls would weaken, drawing the attention of whatever lurked between the trees. The message was clear: union brought safety, separation invited doom. Yet despite years of conditioning, Elias and Lyra sensed something was wrong. Lyra questioned why unity had to take such a binding form, why fear was the foundation of every lesson, and why the elders' eyes always drifted toward the woods when they spoke of the soul. Elias, though quieter in his doubts, felt an unspoken dread building inside him as the ceremony drew near. The closer the twins came to adulthood, the more the elders pressed the importance of the ritual, insisting that refusal was not a choice but a violation of something sacred. And beneath those warnings lay a deeper truth the elders never spoke aloud: the ritual was not about love or unity. It was about protection from something the twins were never meant to see. The night Lyra vanished was the kind of night that felt alive with shadows, when the wind carried whispers through the forest and the moon cast elongated shapes across the ground that seemed almost deliberate in their movement. Rain had fallen in sheets earlier, soaking the forest floor and making each step a struggle through mud and tangled roots, but it had stopped just enough to reveal the path toward the deeper woods. Lyra had been pacing near the edge of the property for hours, her small hands wringing nervously as she muttered under her breath that she could not endure the binding ceremony, that she could not surrender herself to the fate promised since birth. Her brother, Elias, had tried to calm her, placing a hand on her shoulder, but she flinched as if his touch was a tether to the inevitability she was desperate to escape. When she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, she begged him to run with her, to leave the Merrin estate and abandon everything they had been taught, everything that had been drilled into them since infancy about the sanctity of the twin bond. Elias hesitated, torn between loyalty to his family, fear of the unknown, and the instinctive terror that had been instilled in him his entire life. The forest seemed to lean closer as if listening, and the shadows between the trees appeared to stretch, shifting subtly toward them with each heartbeat. Lyra grasped Elias' hand, trembling, and whispered that the forest had always been patient but never forgiving, that the trees themselves could recognize who was loyal to the bond and who defied it. She said there were things in the woods waiting for them if they failed, creatures older than memory that could sense broken souls, that followed even the faintest trace of fear or defiance. Elias could hear the faint rustle of branches behind them, though no wind moved the leaves, and the hairs on his neck rose as he felt the presence of something unseen moving just beyond the line of sight. Lyra insisted they had to run now, before the elders noticed her hesitation, before the ritual could claim her, before whatever lurked in the forest decided they were trespassing on territory it had long protected. With a desperate glance at the house that had been their prison and their home, Elias took her hand, and together they stepped off the beaten path, into the shadows of the trees, following a route that had no markings but seemed guided by instinct. The darkness swallowed them quickly, and every sound, the snap of a twig, the whisper of leaves, the distant cry of a bird, felt amplified, as if the forest was cataloguing their every move. Lyra's voice trembled, urging him forward, warning him not to look back, not to pause, for hesitation meant discovery. And yet, even as they pressed deeper, the boundary between reality and the forest's unseen presence seemed to blur, and the oppressive sensation that something was following, waiting, and watching grew with every step they took. After Elias refused to follow the ritual, the Merrin family became relentless in their pursuit, moving through the forest with a precision that betrayed years of practice and generations of training. Every adult, every cousin, every elder knew the paths, the hidden trails, the gaps between shadows where the forest seemed to allow passage without notice. They did not chase as ordinary hunters might, shouting or leaving marks, but with a silent, patient determination that made the trees themselves seem complicit in their mission. They called Elias a soulbreaker, a term that carried not only accusation but terror, suggesting that the very act of defiance would bring consequences not just to him, but to the entire bloodline. As they advanced, the forest seemed to tighten around him, branches clawing at clothing and skin as if testing his resolve, and the faint sounds of movement behind him were impossible to ignore, a constant reminder that he was being observed with the same vigilance the elders had taught the twins to fear from birth. Elias and Lyra moved through the woods with desperate care, ducking under low-hanging branches, avoiding the shallow ravines and loose stones that might reveal their path. Every snap of a twig beneath their feet felt like a signal to those hunting them, every rustle in the underbrush amplified into the sound of approaching feet. The twins had been trained to read the forest, to recognize when animals fled in unnatural patterns, when the wind carried voices that were not their own, and now those instincts became survival tools. Elias' mind raced, calculating distances, predicting likely positions of pursuers, aware that even a small misstep could alert them. He felt the weight of the Merrin tradition pressing against him, the invisible pressure of every soul that had obeyed the ritual before him, and the knowledge that breaking the chain made him a target not just for his family, but for the dark forces that the ritual had long held at bay. Behind them, the Merrins moved with eerie silence, their eyes flicking to the shadows as though reading signals that Elias could not see, their footsteps carefully muffled, their shapes blending with the trees until they seemed like specters rather than flesh and bone. They whispered to one another in tones that were almost indistinguishable from the wind, communicating plans, correcting mistakes, closing the circle with methodical patience. For Elias, the forest had become a labyrinth of fear and strategy, every tree a potential threat, every sound a warning, every shadow a messenger of doom. And even as he led Lyra deeper into the darkness, every instinct screamed that the Merrins were not merely chasing him to enforce tradition, they were hunting him to reclaim something that did not belong to him, something vital, and that whatever awaited at the end of the pursuit would test the limits of courage, blood, and the fragile line between life and a fate determined long before he was born. The truth that Elias finally confessed was far darker and more complex than anyone outside the Merrin family could have imagined. For years, the rituals and traditions had been seen as cruel, obsessive measures meant to enforce an unnatural bond between twins, a twisted family obsession that outsiders assumed was born from madness or superstition. But Elias' revelation revealed a reality that went beyond human cruelty, rooted in an ancient force that existed in the forest surrounding the Merrin estate. He explained that the twins were not married to preserve tradition or family power, but to maintain a fragile barrier, a delicate seal that kept something older and far more dangerous confined. The bond was meant to synchronize their spirits, to form a unified presence capable of holding back the entity that lurked between the trees, waiting for any disruption in the balance to escape its prison. Every twin who obeyed the ritual, every soul that submitted, was effectively strengthening the seal, and every act of defiance weakened it, giving the forest and its unseen occupant the chance to reach further, to influence the living world. Elias described how, from early childhood, the family had been trained not just in obedience but in vigilance. The whispers, the symbols on the trees, the instructions that forbade separation, they were all designed to prepare the twins for this task, to make them both strong enough and aware enough to serve as living anchors. Those who had been lost or disappeared during prior ceremonies, he explained, had not simply been punished, they had been consumed or corrupted by the force, their defiance opening a door that could not easily be closed again. The realization came to him gradually, after years of noticing strange phenomena in the woods, shadows that moved against the wind, whispers that were not carried by air, and shapes that only appeared when twins were alone. It was not superstition, it was a warning embedded in every story, every practice, every rule that the family imposed. Elias' own refusal, he admitted, had been motivated by fear, yes, but also by the instinct to protect his sister, Lyra, and to confront the idea that the family's obedience had always been at the expense of their freedom and sanity. He confessed that the ritual itself was flawed, that the family had long relied on rote practice rather than understanding the true nature of what they were containing. By speaking the truth, by acknowledging the force for what it was and the real purpose of the bond, Elias risked releasing it entirely. Yet in his confession, there was also hope. Awareness and understanding, he argued, could be as powerful as obedience, if the twins learned to confront the entity together, with choice rather than compulsion guiding their actions. The secret he revealed was terrifying not just for its supernatural implications, but for the moral weight it carried, forcing anyone who heard it to reconsider everything they believed about the Merrin family, their twisted traditions, and the darkness that had waited patiently in the woods for generations. The final twist in the Merrin family's dark history was the revelation that Elias was not simply fleeing from his family, nor from the ritual itself, but from Lyra, his own twin, who had changed into something unrecognizable after rejecting the binding ceremony. The transformation was not physical in the ordinary sense, but spiritual and perceptual, as if the forest had claimed part of her essence and reshaped it into something that existed between human and something older, something that belonged to the shadows. Those who had glimpsed her in the woods later described a figure that moved with uncanny precision, silently observing the movements of anyone who approached, her presence simultaneously alluring and terrifying. Her eyes, they said, held a knowledge no child should possess, reflecting awareness of things beyond the understanding of the living, a consciousness tuned to the rhythm of the forest itself. Lyra had absorbed the very force that the family had tried to contain, and in doing so, she had become both a warning and a predator, an entity capable of crossing the threshold between what the family called safe and the wild unknown. Elias' confession revealed that his flight had not been merely an act of rebellion, but a desperate effort to survive. The elders had trained him for obedience, but they had not prepared him for the realization that the one he loved most, his sister, his twin, was no longer fully human. The closer he came to Lyra, the more he felt a pull, as if her consciousness could influence his thoughts, bending his instincts toward the old ways the family had enforced for generations. He described hearing her voice in his mind when the wind moved through the trees, not just whispering his name, but speaking in strange rhythms, urging him to return, to complete the ritual, to submit to the ancient pact. Yet at the same time, he understood that giving in would erase the last fragments of his own freedom, blending his will into the same force that now animated her. The pursuit became a tense dance through the forest, each step a test of perception, of will, and of the boundaries between self and other. Elias realized that escaping Lyra was not simply about distance, but about understanding the nature of the bond they had been forced into since birth. Every sound, every shadow, every rustle of leaves seemed to carry her presence, a constant reminder that the forest and its unseen powers were no longer merely the family's secret, they were active participants in a game that had begun long before the twins were born and that would continue unless someone learned to confront it deliberately. In this final confrontation, the line between hunter and hunted blurred, and Elias understood that survival would require more than speed or cunning. It would require knowledge, courage, and the willingness to face the terrifying truth of what Lyra had become and what the Merrin legacy had truly summoned.